Hello, team. Hey, thanks for joining us tonight. If you were with us last night, you'll know that tonight's episode is a best of. As we speak, I have about 10, 16, and 17-year-olds in my house committing mayhem. So pray for me. And because of where my studio, I know for lots of reasons, I want to spend time with my 16-year-old on her birthday. That's a big part of it. But also literally because of where the studio is, the room next door is the downstairs lounge. And although I've pre-recorded this, there will be mayhem going on when this is playing out with various games and noise and music and stuff. So I just thought it'd be easiest to take the night off, put a bunch of best ofs on there. I've seen a whole bunch of suggestions that have come in. There's 5 or 6 stories coming up. Some of them are the most popular ones that we've had that have been viewed in the highest sort of numbers, like upwards of 12 views per video. And we'll catch you again from Monday night. So thanks for being with us. Thanks for being generous with your time. Apologies we're not here tonight, but like I said, 16th birthdays only come around once, and we will see you Monday night at 10 p.m. Hooroo. Welcome to the show, Olivia.
Hi, thanks for having me again.
Yeah, no, I'm fascinated at the conversation we're about to have. But before we get into the part that people don't know about so much, as a former lawyer, and I guess as someone who works with startup businesses and involved around employment law, what do you think about the ruling yesterday? And do you have anything you want to comment on that part of it first?
Oh, just seeing that ruling coming through, it's about time. I'm so glad that finally there's been recognition of what's actually going on in Gloriavale. It's a very complicated, many layers to the situation there, and finally someone has set precedent that means that real action is going to be taken now to lift the hood and see what's truly going on.
And that's lift the hood on the money side of things. I think the hood's been lifted before on the George mentioned sexual crimes and that kind of thing side of things. But I don't know. Like I was just talking to someone before we came on, and the Arise situation moved up, the Arise Church situation. And it seems that when money is involved, that drives a lot of the other things as well, because with money comes an amount of power. And it's interesting. I don't know the situation with Gloriavale, but it's interesting, the observation that so many of these religious organizations that are run by men, when money gets involved with that, it goes down a certain dark path. Whereas when these religious organizations are run by women, it's a different situation often. Like if you line up 100 of the worst offenders in the world from religious organizations, probably 99 of them would be men. I mean, I know they're mostly run by men, but it's disproportionate. Which is, like you're known as the catalyst of the Me Too movement. So you want to share your thoughts on that side of it at all?
Yeah, well, and what's also interesting is it's always, they say it's God's will. Is always God's will always directly aligns with what these leaders want as well, and it's often, you're right, it's often very much tied to money, power, but then God's behind them, and they use that as an excuse. Yeah, it's very interesting.
It's weird though how you don't often hear about women. I mean, women within a religious organization or within women leaders, or within they can, there's paths that they can use and abuse, and often it involves luxury and money and expensive car stuff. But when men get that, it involves abuse, sexual offending. There's a different vibe about it, and it's uglier, really is.
Yeah, it all comes down to power and abuse of that, and that's what's going on there at the moment.
Well, listen, you and I had a 2-minute chat this morning, and you blew my brain with what you've been up to in that 2-minute chat. I put a tweet out this morning, and I'll read it. And I am saying, Olivia Wensley joins us live at midday. Well, it's 1:15 midday, to tell her story of helping a 22-year-old woman and her mother escape Gloriavale after coming and going to the West Coast community for 6 years undercover. That's the headline of your story. The floor is yours. I want to hear everything.
Oh, it's I mean, everything would take hours and hours. I'll try and give you a succinct summary of what's happened. I also have to be very careful because it's obviously really sensitive. I want to be respectful to the woman that I helped, and but it's a story that's very interesting. So it began so 6 years ago, my husband and I, this was around about the time that the documentaries were on TV. And I was fascinated by this cult. I've read a
Mm.
lot about cults. I've read about everything in America. It's just sort of real interesting thing, the psychology behind it. So I thought it'd be interesting to be able to go and observe and sort of see what was happening. So we managed to go. We went to one of the concerts there, and it was just oh my gosh, I just like I said, I could talk for hours and hours and hours about what I saw and what it was like. And but it was just very it's unlike anything that you could imagine is happening in provincial New Zealand. It's like a miniature um dictatorship, like a miniature North Korea, because because they've got, they're so isolated and such like they are so unaware of what's happening in the outside world. There's no cell phones, there's no technology, there's very few access to, they call it worldly things. So they're very, very isolated. And but it's I just don't even do you want to ask some questions, because I don't
Yeah.
even know where to even start with
So you kind of
what
you sort of, without being disrespectful to them, you kind of went there on a bit of a goof. You're like, what is this
oh
crazy place
it
all
was
about?
it was yeah, it was interesting. It was out of genuine interest
Yeah.
to go along and have a look, and it was something that just very, very interested to see. So we felt really lucky that we were invited there, and we were always respectful as guests, and they took
Yep.
us in as guests. We stayed there. We
Well,
stayed
let me ask
overnight.
you, how did you manage that? Would anyone be welcome to stay there? Did you have to pull a few fasties to try and
I
convince them that you were safe people? What was the story?
I better not go into that, but
Okay.
we managed to get in, and if that's because it was there was a bit of maneuvering to be able to get the okay to go in.
And this was
Uh,
just because that was at a stage. We're going to go into the story about how you help someone get out, or a couple of people get
mm,
out, but this is not even at that
mm.
stage. You had to make some maneuverings, as you say, just to even get in the door, purely because you were interested to see what it was all about.
That's right. That's right. Because I mean, naturally, they're very cautious and guarded about who comes in, and it's also very carefully managed. So the concerts that they hold are very, very carefully stage managed, so that it's like I said, like the analogy is like North Korea. It's you
Right.
get very carefully guided through and shown this is wonderful. This is a great life that we have here,
Yeah.
and
Okay.
so, but it's pretty easy to see what's actually going on. So it's like stepping into another world. People wouldn't look me in the eye because I was a woman. I'd ask a question and they'd look at my husband and speak to him
Wow.
instead. And it was surreal. So I've been back a few times. So the first time that we met this young woman, and I just got the sense that something, and this is before it was sort of really in the media with what was going on. I just sort of got this very uneasy feeling of what you can tell that the wool's being pulled over your eyes when you're there,
Right.
and what's actually happening. So
Ironically, ironically you can probably tell that because you're worldly, which is the thing that's supposed to be avoided. But because you know what's going on, and we have these
yes,
things called bullshit nerves in the back of our neck, and if something doesn't feel right or look right or smell right, often it's not right. So your interactions with the people were somewhat staged, is what I hear you saying.
very
Probably,
staged, very
yeah,
managed. Yes.
probably that they were supposed to answer in a certain way, and they were supposed to be there. You met this young woman,
Mhm.
and obviously there are details you're not going to share, but you said you
Yes.
visited several times. Did the reason you went
Yes.
back again, again, and again, was it because of her, or like the second time you still kind of, let's go look again? It was interesting. But how did that relationship grow to eventually, 6 years later, you're helping this woman and her mother escape?
Yeah, so it was again, it was sort of, so I went, and I just can't sort of help myself when I know something's not right, that it was like, okay, what can we do? I mean, the first time we visited, it was out of curiosity, but then
Yeah.
I sort of got into the situation where it's like, okay, I just can't sit back and let this happen, because it was very clear that there's very, very bad things happening there. So we went back a couple of years after our first visit and reconnected with this woman. And again, just alarm bells going off. It was all this, it's wonderful here, and it's very clearly not. So there was.
Can you expand on that a little bit? I mean, when you say it's very clear that it's not like if I'm looking at a wall that's painted red, it's very clear that wall is red. It's obvious to me. Can you expand a bit on how and why you knew it was very clear?
Yeah, good question. So it was the mannerisms of everyone around. Everyone was afraid, and so everyone, being the people at Gloriavale, there was a huge amount of fear. No eye contact, very sort of withdrawn and unhappy. The people it was this weird it was like this parade being shown in front of you. The concert was incredible, absolutely amazing.
Wow.
But it was all smokes and mirrors, and it's pretty, it was interesting. So what happened is I saw the young woman again, and we became pen pals, and just over years of just talking to her, building friendship and trust, so that with the view that if she ever needed help to leave and get out, that I was there for her. So
did that communication with you, the pen pals, was that like unfettered? Or do you think that there was an intermediary? Like, would you send a letter that would get read and then passed on and vice versa? Or do you think that was free and open?
All communications were done with the presumption that someone else was reading or listening, because it's very, very vulnerable. A very fragile sort of situation, because she's so vulnerable that I couldn't do anything. That it had to be handled very, very delicately. I couldn't say anything. All I did was maintain friendship and built trust, so that she felt safe if the worst would happen and she needed to get out. So because of that, because it was so difficult to communicate, I actually went there again when I had my baby, who was 8 months old, and I drove there myself, just me and my baby, because that's non-threatening, right? So I went and just had to do a welfare check and check that, and give the offer of help. And it had to be in person, because it couldn't be written, it couldn't be over the phone. And at the time, again, I was told, no, everything is great here. And I could just see behind the eyes, but it's every time I visited, I'd leave and I'd feel very upset and feeling so helpless, a feeling of helplessness, because it's not just, there's hundreds of women and children in there who are at danger, who are being harmed. A policewoman that I've been speaking to about the situation, she's actively involved in the community. She calls it New Zealand's biggest crime scene. And it is. Yeah. So the statistics of sort of what's actually going on there in terms of abuse with women and children, it's just mind-blowing. And so that's why I'm so glad to see this ruling, because it's actually affirmative action that's going to do something, instead of, the Labour inspector going in and saying, no, nothing to see here, because it's obviously everything's scripted. And I mean, if I could go in the first time and say, hold on, this isn't right. There's one thing that people may be saying, and they're coached to say that, but the reality is a totally other thing. So these people, they all have to sign a contract by the time they turn 18. They have no idea what a contract is. They have no idea. That says that it's witnessed by an independent lawyer. I've seen a copy of the contract, and they think that they're signing their lives away, and that they'll be damned to hell for all eternity if they break the contract. And so it's just, it's hopeless. And so that's why government intervention is very, very important.
Makes me think of the Scientology stories where you hear them signing million-year contracts from what they're going on, and then they get told if you break it, it's whatever the result for Scientology is. You've mentioned words like unhappy and scared. You said that they were unhappy and they were scared, but you're also saying that they're all kind of going, oh, everything's fine. Is that your interpretation of what you saw, or was someone kind of, I can't say too much, but it's pretty bad here. So what you saw with them being unhappy and scared, that's your interpretation, or some of them actually say it to you?
No, what happened is I connected with leavers, and I managed. What happened is I met this woman who was a teenager when I first met her. She was 16. And because I had this feeling, this spidey sense, hold on, oh, this is not right. I managed to find that she had a sister who had escaped when she was 18. So then I was able to contact the sister and speak to her about the family dynamics. And lo and behold, it's an absolute nightmare of a story. Just so much abuse, so much horrible, horrible things, so much suffering. And so speaking to her, it made me sure that, yeah, okay, right. It gave me sort of tools to be able to help.
Right.
And sort of pull together others that were able to help as well. There's a huge network of people that are behind the scenes, keeping undercover, and to try and sort of pull this thing apart, because it needs to be, it needs to come down. It's modern slavery in New Zealand.
Wow. I'm interested as to the events surrounding you getting the two people out. I much like you am someone, this is what I believe you've said, who is really interested in the idea of cults and that sort of thing. I've studied a lot of them all through my era, and I'm quite fascinated at the Scientology story and what Leah Remedy's been doing, that kind of thing. And hearing the stories of how some of the ex-Scientologists have had to get literally out of a complex, like hiding in boots and all that kind of stuff. I'm interested to hear what you can share. Don't know what there is about the actual events of these two people. You know, at midday they're in the complex, and at 1 p.m. they're, whatever the time difference is, they're on the road away from the complex. Can you tell us that story and how that actually happened?
It's really, again, I don't want to be difficult, but it's sort of what happened is it's very, very sensitive. But what happened is how can I say this? The woman who needed to get out needed somewhere safe that they could trust to go to. So what happened is they were able to leave. There was an event that happened that they were able to use as a reason to get out temporarily. And I was able to get them, if that makes, So sorry I don't mean to be too opaque, but it's sort of, I was able to take them into our home. We were able to get them emergency accommodation. We were able to, oh my gosh, integrating them into society was very, very interesting. It's what an experience. I mean, it's because the situation is like almost refugees, but in their own country, if that makes sense. Culturally, huge culture shock. Even just going shopping is very, very overwhelming and scary. Even things like crossing the road, that comes so naturally to us. You know, it's sort of that kind of, they have to really think and focus to sort of be able to it's a huge cultural shock when people leave. And I'm just so amazed at how brave they are. Oh my gosh, it's just so resilient, especially so the girl's sister who I got to know really well, where she's come from after being out for a few years. She's studied, she's graduated, she's living her best life. She was here in Queenstown doing bungee jumps and sort of really like living life to the fullest. So that was incredible to see the transformation, and the woman that her sister who we helped when she came out and got her integrated to society as well. She's really flourishing. Like, it's just amazing to see how well she's doing. And she's got a massive journey ahead of her. It doesn't make sense what's happened to her, and coming out and realizing she's been lied to her whole life. And it's it's mind-blowing. But there's really great work being done there's a Gloriavale Leavers Trust in Timaru, and they do huge work. Yeah, it's I mean, what we did is just nothing in comparison to the huge work gone on by so many volunteers and people housing whole families that just escape and show up on their front doorstep. So
I think I was watching News Hub last night. It was one of the channels. I might have been watching it on YouTube, and there was a report about what was going on. And they said, whilst Gloriavale hasn't responded to the accusations, one of the claims that was made is that the site was locked down and all of the members had their cell phones and stuff taken off them. The one release that came out of Gloriavale was the reporter had spoken to the person in charge, and the person in charge had said no cell phones have been taken off. That's not true. What is your vibe to that?
No cell phones were taken off because they're not allowed cell phones.
Right. So I mean, that's probably meaning the leaders still all have their cell phones, but
Yes.
none of the 20-year-olds have had their cell phones taken away because they don't have cell phones.
No, they're not allowed. So there's not even any cell phone coverage. There is Wi-Fi there. So some of the select few are allowed to access Wi-Fi. But this is what the problem is. It's very dangerous. And this is what I've been saying needs to happen is if they want to make sure that everyone there is okay, they need to give them access to tools to say, I need help. Because when you hear some of the escape stories, it's just unbelievable. They're so remote. They're so remote. It's like a dirt road to get there. No cell phone reception. It's just literally in the middle of nowhere. So you have people sort of escaping by walking down the river or just walking down the road, not even knowing where they're going or what's going to happen.
So you're 20 something year old and mother that you helped get out. Had they ever been to a city before? Had they ever been to the main road? So
they're allowed to go to Greymouth occasionally for very, very occasionally, and it's strictly monitored. So they don't have freedom. They've got no concept of what money is or anything like that. So that was very interesting. It was hard actually getting when you have people coming out of that when they've got no bank account or they've got no concept of money or no concept of just helping them, sort of teaching them all about these things that we learn as kids. I helped them get their driver's license, which was really neat. So we got them doing the road code and doing that. And that was a huge step. So this kind of thing, it was really, really rewarding and hard, but really rewarding to be integrating them into society and showing them
their points about them being
life.
in their own country. Like I've experienced like working in the Pacific Islands and then coming home and being incredibly grateful for the resources I had at home, or going from Auckland, for example, where I grew up as a kid, the supermarkets and ending up in Los Angeles and being like, oh my goodness, they've got two aisles of cereal and nothing else. Or I'm also reminded of people who come out of prison who kind of can't function because they're not used to being able to walk out the front door. And it reminds me of all of those, but it feels then 10 times more serious and 10 times heightened because they're actually people, it's not that they've done nothing, yet they have all these same non-experiences to then experience as adults. It must be wild.
It is. And it's sort of like the refugee analogy is definitely right, but it's almost one step further because at least refugees in their home country, they're taught about what money is. They have this sort of exposure to an outside world of some kind. So it's like coming from another planet for them. That's why I'm just so amazed and in awe of the resilience and adaptability of these people that have made this leap from, I mean, it's a hell on earth in there. But they figure that there's nothing that they're taught that they will literally go to hell forever if they go outside, and yet it's still worth it to them.
Wow.
And that shows how bad it is in there.
New Zealand's biggest crime scene. Was that the quote?
Yes.
That I think there's the heading for our thumbnail, Olivia, for this piece that goes out, because that's horrific.
And I'd believe it because just in my anecdotal evidence, I would believe that. Yeah.
Last question. Are you still going backwards and forwards, or is this kind of blowing your cover, so to speak? Is it still something you're going to try and do again?
It's blown my cover now, but I'm happy that that the girl is safe, and that's been a real win. Just getting her out. I mean, it's just, I know there's hundreds left in there, but it's just helping one has been really, really rewarding to get her on a new track to life. She's going to study soon, and so that's fantastic. But in terms of going back there, probably not. It's probably just going to cause more trouble than it's worth in terms of visiting the people that I still know in there. I need to be very, very careful.
Yeah. Olivia Wensley. Hey, look, thank you so much for joining us. It's a fascinating story. The idea of the helping one, I remember there's that, it's not an idiom, but the story that people sometimes talk about the guy walking down the beach, and the beach is covered in starfish. I don't know if you've heard this story before. Beach is covered in starfish, and he's walking with his friend, and he bends down and he picks up a starfish and he throws it into the water, and his friend goes, "Man, look, what are you doing? There's thousands of these starfish. You can't make a difference." And the dude picks up, bends down again, picks up one more, throws it in, and he goes, "Well, it made a difference for that one." And then moves on. So I think it's a similar sort of story, and it's pretty amazing what you've done.
And it's not just that, it's all the children that she would have been forced to have.
Yep. And so it's a generational thing.
Yeah. And that's what it really comes down to. You know, if you save one, but it's also you're saving 12 kids that would have been born into that, and so on. So it needs to come down. It needs to be broken up. It's just appalling that it's allowed to exist.
Hey mate, thanks for joining us today. It's amazing.
Thank you. Thank you.
Where we definitely want to start is with a story that, I don't know about you, Chewy. I saw the story came out and I went, yeah, I've known this for a couple of years, because it's not a unique story to the world about dis and misinformation coming from a small number of people. But this is a report specifically that looks into what happened around Parliament grounds and what happened with a dozen people providing most of the mis and disinformation. Disinformation researcher Byron C. Clark is going to join us. In fact, I'll bring Byron in now, and then we'll watch the setup to this article, and then we'll have a chat. Byron, good evening to you, mate. How are you?
Hey, good, thank you.
Hey, Byron.
Good to be with you, man. So look, what we'll do to start with is we'll just play this kind of 60 seconds, and that kind of sets up the whole story for us, and then let's have a chat. Everyone cool?
Yep.
Here we go. So this is the story as per, and I guess it was probably this morning because I see Maddie there on TVNZ Breakfast.
100 arrests and cleanup costs swelling to more than $1 million. The Wellington occupation was about vaccine mandates, but some in the protest push conspiracies, extremism and far-right ideology. Many say misinformation is the reason why. Fresh research from the Disinformation Project says 73% of that misinformation during the occupation came from only 12 individuals. The changing narrative of the protest boiling down to what the researchers call the Aotearoa dozen. During the protest, the highly utilised, unmoderated, alternative social media site Telegram grew by 100,000 people to more than 350,000 people. Over on Facebook, a page identified as a misinformation superspreader generated the first and second most engaged with Facebook posts in New Zealand. And on the 11th of February, videos that involved misinformation were viewed more than any content from mainstream media.
So there you go. There's the setup. Now, they called them the Aotearoa dozen, and the only reason they didn't call them the disinformation dozen, as I said how this feels familiar, is way back, a year, 18 months ago, 2021, it was reported out of the US that just 12 people are behind most vaccine hoaxes on social media, research shows. So this is not the same research. When I saw the TVNZ headline, I was like, yeah, we know this. We've heard this before, but that's a New Zealand specific amount of research. This one was the Disinformation Dozen, produces 65% of the shares of anti-vaccine misinformation on social media platforms, says Imran Ahmed, who is the chief executive of the Centre for Countering Digital Hate, which identified the accounts. So, Byron, it's not a news story around the world, but it's sort of new to New Zealand. What do you want to tell us about it?
Yeah, so I guess this report sort of showed some things that we'd all kind of suspected about the impact disinformation was having, and the fact that 73% of it is coming from, it's not 12 individuals as such, but 12 accounts. So some of them might be like a fake news outlet that has multiple people behind it, but these 12 sources, and it shows the impact, I guess, that a small number of people really working to propagate this disinformation can have, especially seeing those graphs there, the days where they were getting more engagement than the traditional mainstream media.
It is also a side point that for a long time we've been talking about how mainstream media is nowhere near as powerful as not necessarily independent media, but certainly social media, and shall we say, viral movements from small groups. And when something catches on social media, it becomes far more powerful and popular than mainstream traditional news media outlets can. And I guess this just echoes and confirms all of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've dabbled in looking at these Telegram channels and that sort of thing, and I guess one of the things that I noticed is the amount of sock puppet accounts. They'll essentially be having conversations with themselves to give this perception of a much bigger movement than there actually is. Do you think that that's sort of just massively spun out of their wildest dreams over this whole COVID conspiracy tangent? It seems to have drawn in so many groups that wouldn't necessarily have anything to do with each other, but they've latched onto this one thing.
Yeah, I was up in Palmerston North earlier this week because I was invited to speak at Massey University about the alt-right and about disinformation. And the metaphor I've started using, which I've got from a speech that Michael Wood gave in Parliament while the protest was happening outside, where he talked about there being a river of filth, which is a powerful image, but I also think a good metaphor, because if you think of a river, it doesn't have a single source. There'll be a whole number of tributaries coming into that, and that's what we saw with the protest. We had, like the Destiny Church front group, Freedom and Rights Coalition, and then we had people associated with Counterspin Media, people associated with the New Conservatives, all these people who don't all agree with each other, and there's a whole lot of infighting and things, but they all sort of came together, these tributaries to the river of filth, and then we just get this torrent of disinformation and of anger, and that all erupted in Wellington over that 3-week period.
And Chewy, what you were saying is these different groups coming together, which is why I kind of had a bit of a sideways glance when they were talking about it was an anti-vaccine, anti-mandate protest, because it wasn't an anti-mandate protest. There was all sorts of causes there, and really the thing that bound them together was we hate the government and we want this government gone, and they're tyrannical. So whether it was, and I'm not actually saying there was abortion protest there, but whether it was like an abortion protest or a vaccine protest or a mandate protest, there was all these, they found a place to bring 10, 25 different groups together and say, yeah, fuck you, government, for our reason. And it got sold as an anti-mandate protest, which it completely and clearly wasn't.
Yeah, and I think once those groups started building, and they're like, oh, we can't have these conversations on Twitter, we can't have these conversations on Facebook. There's a new platform. We're all going to Telegram. And the way that Telegram works is it just funneled people into these ideas or this space that people wouldn't have hung out in beforehand. Like, I mean, I know people here in Dunedin that were COVID as a hoax, anti-mandate, all of that sort of stuff, and they came into it from the healthy living, crystals, and peace and love sort of thing, and now they're hanging out in Telegram channels with avowed neo-Nazis. But they're like, oh no, we don't pay any attention to those views that person has, but we're all pulling in the same direction as this. But it's exposed them to these views. And if you don't believe this one thing that someone's telling you, then you might believe this other thing, and you just get led down the garden path of it. And it's one of the things that I've always said is that there's nowhere near as many of these people as it looks like. One of my favorites, and he's one of yours as well, Byron, is Damien Dement.
Oh yes, yeah.
And I'm sure that dude just rattles around on the internet having conversations with himself like 90% of the time.
What you're talking about, Chewy, is the concept of the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Yep.
And it's something that we've heard and seen a lot. It's something that gets used in armed conflict. It was something that we got taught a lot about in the early 2000s with America going into, Iraq and that, and then arming people who were traditionally their enemies, but because they had a common enemy, they found some kind of simpatico between them. But what happens when you work with people, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, eventually you get to a point or you get to an issue where you disagree with that person. So these kinds of relationships are never long lasting, because after you go outside the bounds of what you're joined on, you conflict over the other 99 things that you're not joined on. Have we seen that at all in this, Byron? Like, I mean, we have to admit that protest was very, very well attended with groups of people. They had that month after kind of re-protest, which kind of went, Hurr. But what's been you research this, what's been the follow-on from the protest amongst those sorts of Telegram, Facebook groups, those sorts of groups?
Yeah, well, I think we saw some infighting among the different groups pretty early on. Like even on that first day of the protest, the groups like the Freedom and Rights Coalition were a bit more moderate and a bit more willing to, go and move their cars that they'd blocked the road with. And then there were more radical individuals like Calvin Elb of Counterspin, pushing for them, not to cooperate with police and be more extreme. And, he at one point, called on the military to stage a coup, which is kind of a ridiculous fantasy, but sort of gives you an idea that there's more radical extreme sort of, and then there are the more moderate groups, and then more moderate too than, say, Freedom and Rights Coalition, a group like Voices for Freedom, who, have some worrying politics and a worrying worldview, but not really in the same category as Counterspin. I think after the protest, they've loosely held that coalition together. Counterspin at the moment, they've managed to get their hands on a bus and found somebody willing to print it up with all the Counterspin logo and slogans and things, and they're driving around the country holding all these public meetings. So pretty soon the disinformation mobile will be pulling up in your town. But I'm noticing at these meetings, they're getting people to speak in each location, and they got Sue Gray in one of them, who's leading the Outdoors and Freedom Party, they're calling themselves now, because they've got to put the word freedom in there, so they've just changed that with the Electoral Commission. But then they've got Matt King, who's founded his new party he's speaking at another one. They had one meeting where they got Brad Flutie and Vinnie Eastwood to reconcile their differences, because they're two who have clashed before. So they're working at kind of keeping that coalition around and keeping people close together. But I think it could pretty easily fall apart. The other thing that I've observed since the protest, I mean, you'll see if you have a look at that report, and it was in the video at the start, just the enormous growth in followers of these groups on Telegram in particular. There's 100,000. The report also notes, I think, 88,000 new Instagram followers to some of the disinformation accounts on there. I think, the people pushing this disinformation would have been euphoric at that time, just getting all this new audience. But that's plateaued now, and I think it'll probably continue to plateau, and hopefully some people will even drift away from it as they get pulled out of the rabbit hole by friends in Varnau who are saying, hey, come on, get out of this. What have you gotten yourself into?
Well, the other thing about, I mean, like, I don't think anyone can question that there was an element of anti-vaccine within that conversation, even if they were anti-mandate as well. I mean, with research and information coming out even today, 10% of people who have gotten COVID in the first wave are likely to suffer from long COVID. There's going to get to and that's a terrible, horrible, tragic number, but they will get to a point where even I don't know what you call them, the misinformation people, the deniers, the whatever, are going to have someone in their life or know someone in their life that's having a serious impact from this ongoing global health issue. And I wonder if it's not even necessarily the people in the groups. It's not necessarily the Counterspin medias, but it's the one they're speaking to. They're speaking to the person, the uncle on Facebook, who is agreeing with them, writing, but then his wife 6 months later is still suffering from long COVID. then that will change his perspective. And of course, all of us are going, for fuck's sake, all you needed to be was on board at the start of this. And then perhaps, we don't know because it's a virus that can get anybody, but perhaps you would have had more of a chance for your wife, person X, not to be now suffering still 6 months after the fact. So I find it, people kind of tease and mock some of the anti-vaxxers. I'm desperately sad for them because I'm like, I don't want to see anyone go through this. I don't want to see anyone get long COVID. I want to see, I know that the death thing is not quite off the table, but it's hardly there at the moment. But the long COVID thing, 200,000 New Zealanders, they're talking about the next pandemic. It's not a pandemic because it's not an influx of illness, but the next major global, pandemic / health issue is probably going to be long COVID from people who have caught COVID in the current pandemic. And that could go on for years if COVID ever goes away.
I think it's quite difficult because some of these people are so jammed up in this echo chamber now, and it's really hard for the people on the sidelines. Like I've certainly had people in my life that I've watched disappear into this hole, and it's really hard to try and chip through this because for everything that you say to them, they've got all of their other internet friends all saying, well, of course he's saying that, here's all this proof. And it sounds very real. It sounds very much like there's a scientific study. It definitely sounds like there's some people with doctor in front of their name that are backing you up. And all you can be is gentle, and I struggle with that gentle part. There's only so much you can be having these conversations before you go, you know what, fuck it, you're on your own. I can't do this. And that sadness of getting to that point with someone is just real tough at times.
Before we let you wrap up, Byron, because we're going to move on in a second, I'll just say the thing is, too, is there are people with doctors in front of their names who are sharing mis and disinformation. But what people need to remember is if you can identify 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 or 20 or even 100 doctors, let's say in the US, who are on the page where you are as an anti-vaxxer, are you aware there's 1 million doctors in the US? So if 100 are actually vocalizing and confirming your views, what about the other 999,900 doctors that don't? We can always find even a doctor, even a GP, even someone who's involved who will confirm your cognitive bias. But what I would say is go and listen to the other 99.99% and see what they say about it. Byron, why don't you wrap up for us if you've got anything else?
Yeah, I'll put a link to the report in the chat. I've been reading through it, and it's 29 pages, so it's quite lengthy. But there are there's a lot in there that I think is quite valuable, and I'd encourage people go and have a read of that, and it'll really give you some insight into what's happening in this space.
And look, just before you head off as well, we'll share where people can come and find you and have a look at it. But there is actually one more thing from the article of TVNZ. This is part of the TVNZ then went on to have a conversation with one of the people from the research. And this was a point that I thought we could mention as well. The Disinformation Project says people used COVID-19 disinformation like a Trojan horse, which is what we were talking about earlier with many arguments. Initially discussing disinformation, but quietly pushing their own ideas that go larger than the pandemic. COVID-19 was never the only end goal of those sharing and producing disinformation over the past 2 years. They have strong ideas on what New Zealand should look like. The original intent of the protest to audiences was the replacement of the replication of the convoy, and to protest vaccination and the idea of mandates and loss of jobs. While that narrative started the convoy, it did change during the occupation. So by the end, the narrative was around resistance to the state, government, and mainstream media with violent and misogynist language.
Yep.
So that's what the research has found. And I guess, Byron, I said to wrap up before, but if you want to add anything, this is sort of something you do. You've been researching the far right. You've been looking at these issues. Would you echo those? Is that what you've seen? Can you give us anything around that you've seen out there?
Yeah. I mean, I do this research in my spare time, really, I work a day job, and while I am working on a book at the moment that'll be out next year, I still think of myself as a bit of an amateur, and so it's very easy to think, oh, maybe I'm becoming a bit conspiratorial myself, thinking about this stuff, and then to see something come out from a group like the Disinformation Project, who are doing this in such a methodical and a very academic way, and reading that and saying, yeah, okay, that's reflecting what I've observed just in my more amateur research. I mean, it really hammers it home that this is what's happening out there and online.
Excellent. Well, if people want to find out more about you, Byron, and what you do, byron.geek.nz. They can go there and they can check out some of your interviews and your YouTube channel, FAQs, articles, all in there as well. byron.geek.nz. Listen, dude, I know we've talked before. You and I have done a podcast before in general, but it's very cool to have you on this iteration of what we're doing. Big, hairy news. And not that it's about the facial here, but I got to say, it kind of works for me.
Kind of is.
All right, dude. Thanks for joining us today. Thanks for coming on board. We really appreciate it.
Cheers, Byron.
All right. See you, bye. But this is Krystal Ball, and yes, I believe that is her real name. And they say destroys inflation while talking to Bill Maher. So have a listen to her thoughts around inflation. Involves a small conversation around gas prices as well.
Well, I mean, part of this inflationary problem is because we put too much money into the economy. There's way too much government spending, and that's why we have inflation. So that's a large part of that. It's just basic economics. And
that is not basic economics. We had this thing called a pandemic. We had a supply chain crisis, and by the way, there's a war in Ukraine. So to act like the only reason we have problems now is because people got a little bit of money in their bank account is just not honest.
And a little bit of money, they got more than we spent in World War II. So don't act like...
I think I've seen a couple of commentators dispute that and say it's wrong. I think Bill Maher may have a point if he talks about all the money spent during COVID, but not the stimulus packages, which is what they're talking about. So I haven't seen, but I believe I've heard several commentators say that point that Bill Maher there made about the stimulus, which is what they're talking about, is incorrect.
Hold on.
Don't act like you said. Don't act like we had to react to the pandemic exactly the way we did. We had to spend $6 trillion.
Okay, but how about the trillions that the Federal Reserve shot at Wall Street? For some reason, people don't get upset about that.
How much?
And that fueled the trillions of dollars the Federal Reserve shot at Wall Street to backstop the stock market and the bond market. No one gets upset about that, even though that was a massive
I don't know what
factor in
you're talking
inflation.
about. What do you mean shot at Wall Street? When are we talking about?
We're talking about buying assets, buying stocks, buying bonds, buying treasury bills so that they expand the balance sheet. This is during the crisis, the coronavirus crisis. When the stock market crashed, that is what the Fed did. They went into action. They shot trillions of dollars.
But the stock market didn't crash during COVID.
Now it's crashing. It's crashing now.
It crashed, and the Fed came in and backstopped it.
So the right-wing commentator there was no crash. Bill Maher, there was no crash. Krystal Ball now educates him about when there was a crash in 2020.
What happened?
It crashed and we never heard about it?
No, it crashed. Go back and look at it.
I think
it fell off a cliff.
When?
The Treasury bond market stopped functioning, and the Fed took extraordinary action it's never taken in history.
I don't
Somehow
remember
no one
that.
gets upset.
The first week of
Somehow nobody gets upset about the rich people who got tons of money and tons of support, way more than working class people did.
Sure
but
they
oh
do.
my God, people were able to feed their kids and they had a little bit of money in their bank accounts. It was the worst thing in the world.
No.
That is one small part of the inflation story, and is, by the way, not the only thing that we can deal with to get out of this mess.
Well, gas prices.
Biden has
Is it a small
advocated-
part, Jamie?
Gas prices we can largely attribute to an administration that's been waging war on the fossil fuel industry.
That's ridiculous.
And
They
now
drilled more than everybody. I mean,
That's the talking point. That's
U.S.
not true.
production.
No.
Okay, U.S. production is up.
Well,
it will be at record levels next year.
Okay, well,
the fossil fuel companies themselves are flush with cash, but will not invest in new drilling because they would rather give it to their shareholders.
Okay, all right.
So there you go. That's where she. I mean, there's not too much in there that you can challenge her on. I mean, people can. I mean, she constantly was just saying that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong. I mean, I don't know if you've seen that whole clip before, George, but do you want to jump in on that clip before we move through, because there's more to say.
No, let's keep going.
So this is the thing. She talked about the stock market, right? This is the stock market, and this is in 2020. This is the American date, so it's backwards for us normal people. The third month of 2020, there's the stock market crash. So the point that was being made is even if the stimulus checks did contribute to inflation, far more money was pumped into the stock market by the government to make sure that crash came back quite quickly. So more money was put into, as Krystal is saying, the wealthy people with portfolios, stock market portfolios, got more of a benefit out of government money than anybody did buying a few groceries here and there. So just to show you, that is the stock market crash that we are talking about. The other thing I wanted to talk to you about, and we've played this clip before, and you'll probably find that we'll play this several times before the next election, is that inflation, what is it, right? Krystal Ball wasn't actually saying that what inflation was necessarily. She was saying that what the others were saying was inaccurate. We've had Michael Redder on a few times, this clip on a few times. This is a conversation he's having on the 8 p.m. News Hub show. When was it? It was in April, when there was a lot of conversation around inflation and who's responsible for it. And, it's the government's fault. It's about government spending. That was the saying that National was saying, that government spending is causing inflation. There was comments about they've got a spending problem. It's because of they're causing the inflation. So News Hub got on Michael Redder, and Michael Redder is, let me give him his title. He is a former economics advisor to the Reserve Bank. Okay, so there's some credential there. This is what he said about what causes inflation, and more importantly, who is responsible for it.
The blame game well and truly underway here. Where do you sit on that?
Oh, pretty clearly the ultimate responsibility rests with the Reserve Bank. They're given an inflation target by the government. They're given independent powers to adjust monetary policy, and poor inflation outcomes, particularly trend inflation, the persistent bits of it, are only the Reserve Bank's responsibility. Whatever the government does in terms of increasing spending or cutting taxes, there are all sorts of things the Reserve Bank has to take into account when it makes its interest rate decisions. And it's quite clear that they and a lot of other people badly misforecast where things were going a year or so ago and had policy in the wrong place. And then when they finally realised that they needed to be raising interest rates in the middle of last year, they were pretty slow to adjust. The responsibility rests with them.
So there you go. Responsibility for inflation is with the Reserve Bank, and there can be some external forces, but ultimately it's the Reserve Bank, and government spending doesn't attribute very much to inflation. To give you another example of this, Ian Bremner was texting over the weekend. Ian Bremner is a political scientist, author. He teaches at Columbia, and this is what he said. In the US, a left government, high inflation. In the UK, a right government, high inflation. In Germany, a centrist government, high inflation. In Italy, everyone in government, high inflation. Wild guess, it's not the government. And I don't think we can probably say it much more clearly than that. That whilst obviously the government is controlling, they're in control of the books, what happens with inflation is ultimately they're not the people who drive the inflation. And there's very little a government can do to change inflation. The Reserve Bank sets interest rates, which are the main driver behind what actually should do to help inflation. The Reserve Bank's changes in the inflation rate don't come into effect until 9 to 12 months after they set them up. What the Reserve Bank got wrong, and this is Michael Redder, you can watch that whole clip yourself if you want to go search for it, says is one of the things they got wrong is they underestimated the number of people that would be working. They thought that the numbers of unemployed would be higher, so they set their interest rates based on that, and they were wrong. And that means for their correction to come, it's going to take 9 to 12 months from when they started to fix it a couple of months ago. So that's where the inflation responsibility lies, ultimately with the Reserve Bank. Now, I want to talk a bit about petrol as well, because you heard in that clip the conversation around petrol prices, and I don't know if you watch Bill Maher. I can see down here that Ben has talked about Bill Maher. I like Bill Maher, been watching him for years. He definitely ain't perfect, but he often raises a good central left perspective and likes to tease the woke brigade a bit. It's fair, right? He had Kellyanne Conway on a couple of weeks ago, and obviously the talking point in America for right-wing politicians, not that she's a politician, is to talk about gas prices. $6 gas a gallon, $6 gas a gallon, $6. She probably said it 15 times in the conversation through the night. To a point, Bill Maher was joking about it and giving her the answer before she said it. Now, they talked about gas prices in that clip, and I think it's important as well that you could actually look at this tweet and change high inflation to petrol prices, yeah? In the US, left government, high petrol prices. In the UK, right government, high petrol prices. In Germany, centrist government, high petrol prices. In Italy, everyone in government, high petrol prices. In New Zealand, left government, high petrol prices. Wild guess, it's not the government. And that's actually true. It's got very little to do with the government, petrol prices in New Zealand. Around the world, if it's a trend that's happening around the world, it's very hard to hold responsible your political party to do that, your government to do that. Now, if you want to hold them responsible for not putting out some ways to help, that's fine. Like, let's say, wiping all the tax off, which would be a disaster, but, to try and address it. But the actual cost of the petrol has very little, again, to do with the government. And let me give you an example of why this is, or how this is. So this is the price of crude oil for the last 20 years. Right here is where petrol was pretty much at its highest it's been in the last 20 years. June of 2008, $187 a barrel. All right. This is where we are now. $108, $110 a barrel, round figures. $114 a barrel. Let's call it 110 because I think it's 108 right now. $110 a barrel. Now, in 2008, when it was, what is that then, a third higher, even more than that, a third higher, the price of petrol in New Zealand was $2.18. Now, if petrol's more expensive, if oil's more expensive, yet petrol's cheaper, something's going on. Because if the cost of fuel comes back to the cost of crude oil, it should have been more expensive in 2008, but it wasn't. It was cheaper by about a third, about $1 cheaper per litre. And I'll tell you why that is. I have the answer. I'll feed you, baby birds. What happened when I should bring it back up actually, because I'll show you exactly where it was. What happened when the price of crude oil crashed right here, right when COVID kicked in 2020? See, it's down at $20-something a barrel. What happened when crude oil prices crashed is the people who produced the petrol, they pulled back on their production because petrol wasn't being used, because we were all locked in our house for between 4 weeks and 3 months or whatever it is around the world. So the demand for petrol dropped off. So the producers of petrol, what they did was they stopped producing as much. And guess what? They haven't increased their production numbers since. So what we're seeing right now is an issue to do with production and the producers that they could solve tomorrow. Yeah, someone's talking about Russia and the Ukraine as well. You put that in there, put the war in there as well. But what we're seeing is a production issue that could be changed tomorrow. If you ran a business and you were making more money off producing half as many widgets as you were 5 years ago, then you wouldn't want to produce any more widgets because you're making more money off the half you're producing now. That's the equivalent as to what's happening right now with petrol prices. Half the number, and I'm using half as an example, there's fewer barrels of petrol or fewer litres of petrol have been getting produced since the crash in 2020, and they've never increased that production since. So the people, and you heard Krystal Ball references a little bit when she said the petrol companies are flush with cash because they've got fewer outgoings and they've got more money coming in because the demand is higher, because they haven't increased the production of petrol, which means the price is going up. That's what's driving petrol up, the price of petrol up, and it's the petrol manufacturers that could fix it tomorrow and drive the price back down again. So here's a conversation that went on the AM show this morning. Louise Wallace hits out at fat women in fashion advertising during the AM panel. The first clip we're going to look at, Nathan, that's Nathan King from Z, yeah? So Nathan is talking about, it was quite funny actually, we're not going to watch the whole thing, but Nathan starts talking about one of the things we can do to help, obesity in society. And he talks about a sugar tax. And as soon as he starts talking about we should do something about it, him and Louise is nodding away. And as soon as he starts talking about a fat tax, her face is like, oh. And you can just see that she's like, no, not into that, not into the sugar tax. So Nathan's just finished the conversation about a sugar tax, and then the conversation goes on.
But are they feeding us that?
Hey,
or are
fundamental
we
that, just tape over people's mouths with gaffer tape.
Yeah. Oh.
I mean...
Pretty funny. Gaffer tape on people's mouths. That'll solve the problem, my jokey joke. Now just think, and I'm not trying to be sensitive to this, but just think if that was said about any other physical attribute of a human being in that kind of way. Like, think of a way to make a particularly offensive joke about it that, that was the whole studio just laughed at, sort of thing. There's an interesting standard for being able to talk about fat people, overweight people.
I mean, sooner or later, sooner or later, surely it's what goes in here. And what people, and I think that unfortunately we have normalised the idea of being overweight, normalised it. And I'll give you an example of that, is that when I was overseas quite recently, you would pass by these huge ads and for fashion, like whether, I don't know if it was Zara, but something like that, and there would be distinctly overweight women, like, dare I say it, fat women in these ads advertising clothes, and that is now seen as normal.
Doesn't it reflect what normality is? Doesn't it tell people
Doesn't
that...
mean it's right, though, and it's not right because people are getting sick.
If it's unhealthy,
it's
not a good thing.
So there's really interesting words used in there about it's not right. To me, that's a value judgment. You know, I think it's okay to put out there, you know, it's not a healthy choice. It's an unhealthy situation to be in. We know that. But the idea of right and wrong, because if it's not right, that means it's wrong. That means to be overweight is wrong. And that's a really heavy way and a heavy language to put on someone, and I'll talk about this more shortly, and I'm happy to talk about my own experiences, that it's not quite as easy as, well, just stop eating then. You guys want to jump in before we go on?
Yeah, I just want to say that with these chat panels and stuff like that, you see this a lot. I'm just going to shotgun a real simple reckon out there with absolutely no nuance on it at all. Like, if we want to talk about how New Zealanders are generally heavier than they have been over the last 40 years, let's talk about it. Let's talk about the food options that are available. Let's talk about how much the supermarkets have, you know, what's the most affordable foods out there.
Yeah.
You know,
and in this conversation, Nathan King makes that point. He says, you know, it's also a sociological issue or a societal issue that the cheapest foods are often the worst for you as well.
And if we want to talk about advertising, let's talk about the fact that this is probably quite jarring to her, because we've had, again, for as long as advertising has existed, we've had really, really thin people for everything. And now we're seeing more advertising reflecting who's going to be wearing these clothes. And she's like, oh, they're fat. You know, they might be. They might also be normal, you know? And she's just going, oh, they're heaps bigger than the models that we used to have. Yeah, but they're normal people that you would see in the street and that sort of thing. So, yeah.
You know, when someone offers opinion, and we hear this term quite a lot in society today in commentary, and you can go, that opinion is just completely based in some kind of misogyny or sexism or white supremacy or whatever it is. The way she speaks, I don't know if there is such a thing as like fat phobic, but seems to me to be completely based in that adage of demeaning hatred towards fat people.
Oh, you can hear it in her voice.
Wrapped up in a, well, we just want to make them healthier. But to me, and being honest, who's heard this kind of stuff his whole life, it doesn't come across like someone caring for their health. It comes across like someone going, ew, fat people.
I don't want to see that. Yuck.
Yeah.
Yuck.
Yeah, it reminds me of I imagine this is why the AM show has done this, because of the whole Jordan Peterson sort of thing that popped up over the past few weeks about fashion magazines and having women on the front of fashion magazines and how that was going to destroy the fabric of Western civilization, etc., etc. I mean, in this example, she sort of conflates the words normal with the words right, you know, as opposed to wrong, which is you know, a sort of often a sort of language tactic that you'll see that people do just, you know, subconsciously, which is a great example of what we call ideology, right? Ideology is how things are constructed as being normal or natural or the truth or whatever that is, right? And, you know, I mean, that's the conflation of those two words that she does there. The other thing would be, sorry, no, you Pat, go. You go.
I was just going to say as well, what you were saying before, Chewy, about always being skinny. I don't actually quite think that's true. there are different standards for different eras. Famously, I think Marilyn Monroe, who was the sex icon of her era, was either a size 16 or a size 14 or something. And that was the, we all hear about in history the idea of the Rubenesque woman. And, heroin chic was big in the 1990s, and that's not acceptable at the moment. And in fact, we can play a little bit here and giving Ryan Bridge some credit. He goes on to talk about sometimes, we also think that having models that are too skinny is not acceptable.
But in the same way, there was outcry when we put too skinny models on the fronts of magazines.
That's unhealthy too, though. You just have to be normal. But I look at all of us, and you're a bit skinny, but I look at all. Mate,
I've been working out.
Can I just point out as well?
What a horrible exercise. Yeah.
Can I point out as well? A 62-year-old, and I'm not saying about this anyone in particular, but in general, having plastic surgery to look younger is not normal. Because that's actually a false image being put forward, and in my opinion, quite an unhealthy one as well, of what's being modeled to society about having people who refuse to look their age and would choose to go have an operation where knives cut into them to look a younger age than they really are. Just kind of putting that out there as what is and isn't normal.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily try to play their own game of what is sort of what's meant to be normal and how we display it. I'd just call her a dumb bitch. We don't really need to sort of. She looks like a bitch.
You can't look at somebody in a window who's modelling a fashion brand and perhaps they're a size 16 and say that they're unhealthy. That doesn't mean that they're unhealthy.
Okay, well, fine then. Then you can't have it both ways. You can't have it both ways. So you either advertise people with people who have what I would see as a normal body, maybe a size 12 or 14. You put a size 18 there, people think that's normal and it's healthy. Might be healthy when you're 25. When you're 55, it won't be.
And look, this is the thing that is difficult with these kinds of conversations. And when you hear about, like I said before, about a conversation or a comment that's wrapped up in some kind of ism, but really the ism is the thing driving the commentary. Actually, to say carrying too much weight is unhealthy, it's perfectly acceptable. It's perfectly acceptable to have the opinion that, not having as much fat around your vital organs, around your heart, carrying it for wear and tear is a better option than not. But to use words like you are not a normal human being. Now, she didn't say it quite as bluntly as that, but she used the word as not normal. I mean, what is normal? Normal to me would be like what is common. And actually, I'm not saying it's a good thing, but being obese is kind of common in Western society. And then if, like what I think, Chewy, you were saying, if you look in various groups of people, like, for example, people with less money, being obese is even more common because, as we all know, the foods that are accessible to someone with less money are less nutritionist, are less full of nutrition, decent nutrition, but are massive amounts of calories. So it's just there's a lot that we'll play one more clip and then go on. But before we do that, do you guys have anything else? You were going to say something else here, George, and you allowed me in.
Yeah, the other thing I wanted to mention, and this comes up a lot, is there's this almost fallacy that is at the center of their conversation, and that's that somehow the fashion billboards that she's seeing are going to sort of, poison people to become fat, right? These people put so much sort of faith in the media that they consume for themselves that they just assume that everyone else is like zombies for fashion billboards. I mean, it's totally not the case, right? A fashion billboard, having someone, again, the Jordan Peterson example, having someone who's a bit more chubbier than the traditional fashion model on front of a magazine is not going to make people fat. It's food that's going to make people fat.
Yeah, just remember, you've got to change your life to make sure that this person, Louise Wallace, is happy. Certainly don't factor in your own life or happiness into it. She just doesn't want to see you if that's cool. So, just get on to that. Just gaffer tape your mouth shut.
Yeah,
I know whose mouth I'd like to gaffer tape shut.
And that's been suggested in the comments as well. Before we play these comments, let's actually put up. Sorry, play the last clip. Let's put some of these comments out there. A couple of comments from Carl. He says at one point, the old adage, if they're not what I consider a healthy size, then they're fat. It's so tiring, to be honest. Carl also goes on to say, what if you're Polynesian? Our body sizes are completely different. Because that's also another thing. Like, I mean, I know she's not saying necessarily BMI, but the lie of the BMI, you know, like if BMI was what we took, then every male who was a sporting athlete would be morbidly obese because they just purely base it on weight. And if you were a muscular, like all the front row of the All Blacks would be on death's door according to the BMI. So whilst it is a yardstick, it's not a particularly good one. Kim says, I imagine that the advertising must work. And that's an interesting point as well. So Louise Wallace is kind of putting all this weight into the idea, pardon the pun, into the idea of what this will do to, rather than going, oh, this is going to sell our clothing, Louise Wallace thinks this is going to sell the person's body. And like if it's a plus size model wearing jeans, it seems that she's saying that people are going to see that advertising and not want to buy the jeans, but want to look like the model. That makes no sense to me whatsoever. I think what Kim's saying is the advertising must work. There must be also pitching to a sector of society that needs those genes, whatever it is, and so you have those people in place. If you want to sell a pair of size 17 or 18 or 20 jeans, then it's probably best to use a 17 or 18 or 20 size model as opposed to a size 4 model where the jeans won't look anything like what they'd look on a size 16 or 17 or 18 size female. I don't know. Let's play this last clip. And this is actually going back to the sugar tax, which is why I didn't pay the first one. And Nathan has an idea of how the sugar tax could actually work.
I want to say real quick that people slam this whole sugar tax going, oh, it doesn't work. But what if we, like, you take that money and you put it towards something like, picture this, like a My Food Baggie kind of thing, but it's available for the nation. Yeah. It's run more centralised, and it's like, because obesity is a problem so it's socio-economic as well. And because cheaper food is usually more unhealthy. I'm like, let's subsidise like a healthy food box that you can get the whole nation eating healthy. New Zealand could be a very awesome place.
No, I'm going to cut off the last comment from her because, as we've all said, no one else wants to hear.
Oh, you can tell she's winding up to something.
Yeah. She wants to tell people to plant veggie gardens. That was what her comment is afterwards. She's like,
oh, again, it's so basic. It's so basic. You know, when she's harking back to the good old days of every family having a veggie patch. Yeah. Do you know what else was common around there? One person working. And also not living till you were 62, like she is. It's not very normal based on those standards either. Doing a veggie patch is fucking work. You need someone there to tend it. And generally that was the person that stayed home. You know, that was my family growing up in the 80s. Let me also, and this is going to sound really arrogant, but I think for 40 years of overweightness, I've got some say in this, right? It's my lived experience. Drop some knowledge on the overweight issue, right? And this is for real. If people are significantly overweight, we're not talking about 5 or 10 kilos, but significantly overweight, then I believe that the most likely chance is they probably have food addiction issues, because you have to say without question, to get 30, 40, 50, 100 kilos overweight, and they're the people I'm talking about, you have a bad relationship with food. You can't not get to that point and not have a bad relationship with food. Now, that might be a psychological issue, and you use food as an outworking of it. It might be an addictive issue directly to food. And what I learned about myself at one stage in my life was I used food like an alcoholic used alcohol. So if you think about what an alcoholic would do with alcohol, that's what I did with food. Now, it was very difficult for me to have people I know say to me, well, just, go on a diet. Just stop eating. And it was like saying to an alcoholic, well, that's a piece of piss. Just stop drinking, right? So that's the first thing to think about when you're thinking of and looking at significantly overweight people. The second thing is, I read a book by a guy, actor in America, who talks about his food addictions. I can't remember his name. Anyway, it doesn't matter. But he talks about how an addiction to heroin is sexy, but addiction to food is not. An addiction to food is also the only addiction that you have where you have to keep using the thing you're addicted to, or else you'll die.
If you're addicted to a drug, if you're addicted to alcohol, if you're addicted to porn, you don't need that in your life to actually continue living. Think about if you were addicted, if you were an alcoholic, but every day you still had to have a litre of alcohol to survive for the rest of your life. Or if you're a heroin addict and every day you had to have one shot for the rest of your life to survive. That's what it's like for someone who's got a food addiction. They have to continue to have a relationship and interact with the thing that has caused them their troubles in their health and that they're addicted to, but not just put it to the side and go cold turkey or figure out a way through counselling and hard work to not need it anymore. They always need it or else they will die. So it's a very different scenario. Yeah, Paul's saying you can die from heroin withdrawal. I know, but you can also get through that and then not need heroin. But the heroin withdrawal can be immediate and can happen there and then. But after you've gone through that, it doesn't happen a year later. So it's I've found for me, and I think it's important for people to know, to think about it in a different way. To me, to think about, again, significant weight issues, not the 5 or 10 kilos overweight, but the 40 or 50 kilos overweight. You should be thinking about them like an addict, like an alcoholic with alcohol. I'll give you an example, right? I did a quiz online talking about alcoholics, and it was like, do you hide alcohol around the house? Yes, I did that with food. Do you tell lies to cover your intake of alcohol? Yes, I did that with food. So like all of those boxes I would tick as well. Are you sometimes short of money for the monthly bills because of you spending it on food? Yes, I've done that as well. It is really paralleling for a lot of people all the way through. And it's a different concept and a different aspect for people when you understand it's not just lazy fat people who won't stop putting stuff in their mouth. For some people, maybe for a lot of people, I'll say for a lot of people who are significantly overweight, it's a real problem with food that's a lot harder than just stop eating and exercise, like people like this crazy old Bint is going on about. It's not just as simple as that for a lot of people. And for me, like I said, I'm down 24 kilos. It's been 40 years to get to a point where I've been on this journey where I am right now since I was 40. So for, 7-8 years, and it's taken me another 7 or 8 years to get to a point where I've had the ability to actually then do that. So I'm just putting it out there. I'm not trying to, say woe is me, because it's not. But when we think about other people and we think about people who are going through that, I would just encourage people not to think about, look at that disgusting, lazy, fat person, all that. I wish they'd just stop eating and exercise. If you wouldn't think it about an alcoholic or someone, I mean, I guess you could think about it, someone who's got a porn addiction, just stop watching it, but you don't typically think about that, or a drug addict or something like that, then you shouldn't be thinking about it about someone who's 100 pounds or 50 kilos overweight. That's all.
No, good point. Good point.
I thought that the idea from the dude of sending little vegetable boxes around the country was very cute. It's like,
a little dude, Nathan. Yeah, I mean, I guess he's a good egg, is Nathan. And he's looking for.
Yeah, it's sort of indicative of these sort of little ideas where really we've already got supposedly a system set up called a nation state with a welfare system with regulatory powers that is failing because there's a duopoly, there's food that is bad for you that's cheaper than food that is good for you.
Yeah.
And so I guess that's why it rubs me the wrong way, the little boxes of vegetables.
Fair enough. I think what he's probably thinking about, if we tax, for example, the Coca-Colas and Pepsis of this world, what are we going to do with that money? What are we going to do with that money to help the issue? So I wouldn't be surprised if that was a little idea off the top of his head. But actually, Crazy Old World has just talked also about, I mean, if sometimes you struggle to relate to an idea or of like a heroin addict, then just think about smokers. We all know how hard it is to give up smoking. Yeah, and yes, there is 1 in 1,000 smokers that just go cold turkey and they just stop one day and they never pick up another one. But for most of them, it's a real struggle, and it takes a really long time to get rid of that habit, not just the chemical addiction, but the habitual one. I have to tell you, I mean, I wasn't ever really a smoker, but in my 20s at university, at a pub with a drink, you'd light up, or you'd get one off your friend, or that kind of stuff. And I still find myself, when I have a beer in my hand or something, I still find myself doing this when I'm holding the beer, because it's habitual. And I haven't smoked since I was at university, 20 plus years. But there is a habitual thing to break, as well as a chemical thing to break with smoking. And I would say to you again, it's the same in food. I don't know necessarily about chemical, but there is a nutritional thing to break, and there is a habitual thing to break. How many people out there kind of at nighttime when they're not hungry just go, I just feel like something while I'm watching television, and that becomes the cycle, and that becomes the habitual thing that you need to break. I'm just thinking more about it like an addiction, as opposed, and I'm not trying to, play the violin and say, everybody out there who's morbidly obese, just be so nice to them now, and I'm just saying, and honestly, if you see someone who is morbidly, or if you have someone in your life who you never thought this before, think about them like an addict. Think about their relationship with food, like a smoker is to tobacco, or an alcoholic is to alcohol, or a drug user is to drugs, if they're addicted, that is, obviously. And it changes your perspective. It also makes it much easier to think about how to help them, because all of a sudden they're not just fat, disgusting things on a billboard. They're people who have value and need help, and need support, rather than just being scorned as, we don't want to normalize this, do we?
I'm just imagining Louise's head exploding to this whole conversation, and it's very satisfying. I really dislike those just real basic reckons that we get on TV and stuff like that. Whereas in the chat that we've just had, we've gone, okay, here's, like, you got the supermarkets, you got the socioeconomic, you got the psychological, you got the addiction-based issues. That's what obesity is. There's everything there. But for Louise, it was billboards. I don't want to see fatties on a billboard.